Rule 16. Cross-check sources. And exercise set 4.2 from a Workbook for Arguments by Morrow and Weston. Consult and compare a variety of sources to see if other equally good authorities agree. Are the experts sharply divided or in agreement? If they're pretty much in agreement, there is a safe view to take. And the opposite view is, at the very least, unwise, however strongly it may appeal to us. Authoritative views can certainly be wrong at times, but non-authoritative views are regularly wrong. On the other hand, cross-checking may sometimes reveal that the experts themselves disagree on some subjects. In that case, reserve judgment yourself. Don't jump in with 2 feet where truly informed people tread with care. Better to argue on some other grounds or rethink your conclusions. What about our friend Aubrey de Grey, then, and our hopes of living 1,000 years? Alas, when you start to cross-check, it turns out that de Grey's work is widely regarded as well-developed, and his research is certainly worth pursuing, but very few other experts are persuaded. Many are sharply critical, in fact. He's an outlier. Living vastly longer may be appealing, but don't count it very likely. On most significant topics, you can probably find some disagreement if you look hard enough. Worse, on some topics, the appearance of controversy may be created even when there's virtually no disagreement among qualified authorities. Although there was a time when experts disagreed about global climate change, for example, the world scientific community is now nearly unanimous that climate is changing and that human activity has something to do with it. Sure, there's still loud disagreement in some media and election campaigns, but virtually none among trained climate scientists looking at the data as objectively as they can. There are also a few reasoned critiques of the climate change consensus, but in the best judgment of almost everyone actually in the field, they do not change the bottom line. Some of the critiques have even sharpened the science, but the critics, even when qualified, are very markedly outliers. Ideology seems to be the driving force here, not actual evidence or professional judgment. You may need to look into seeming controversies like these to see how serious to take them. Alright, now we'll move on to exercise set 4.2, identifying independent sources. The objective of this exercise is to give you practice identifying independent sources. Rules 14, 15, and 16 deal with 3 important features of arguments that use sources. Rule 14 requires that sources know what they're talking about. Rule 15 requires that sources be unbiased. But what about Rule 16? Rule 16 requires more than just checking multiple sources. When you're using multiple sources, it's important that your sources are independent of one another. 2 sources are independent of one another when neither one is getting its information from the other. The idea of independent sources is best illustrated by an example. Suppose that days before a mayoral election, a polling organization announces that the incumbent candidate is well ahead in the polls. On the basis of this announcement, the local newspaper runs the headline, "Mayor on track to win second term." If you cite both the polling organization and the local newspaper, have you cross-checked your sources? No. Since the local paper got its information from the polling organization, it's not an independent source. Citing the newspaper does not strengthen your argument. You would need to cite another source that did its own independent polling in this case. Alright, here's the instructions for this exercise set. For each of the following questions, think of 2 informed, impartial sources that you might cite in an argument. You do not need to find or cite specific sources. You can just describe the kind of sources that you have in mind. Be sure your 2 sources are genuinely independent. That is, that neither gets its information from the other, and that the 2 are not relying on the same source for their information. Okay, here's a sample. Are gluten-free diets healthier for most people? Well, one place that we can go to get information about that is a scientific paper published in a reputable medical journal. A second place that's independent is a professional dietitian, a specialist in the science of nutrition, other than the ones who wrote or were cited in the scientific paper used for source 1. All right, here's another example. What is the best way to get from Vancouver to the popular ski resort in Whistler, British Columbia? Well, two independent sources that we can look to are a travel guidebook for Canada and someone who lives in Vancouver and goes to Whistler frequently. Here's another example. How do I write a good paper for a philosophy class? Interesting question. Your philosophy professor can be one source, and then the website of Jim Pryor, a philosophy professor at New York University, whose site contains useful tips on writing good papers, can be another source. 5. Is it possible for deadly viruses like Ebola to become airborne, meaning that they could spread from person to person without direct contact? Two independent sources, the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and a scientific paper published in a reputable academic journal, though you'd have to make sure that neither one of these cites the other.